I am Nayyera. I host radio on SiriusXM. I'm a recovering government official who worked in national security. And so I am deeply honored and excited to be moderating this conversation today with four of our esteemed leaders who are working out in the trenches to get people to care about what's happening with American democracy and do something about it, and representing such a wide variety of interests. So thank you all for being here. I want to introduce to you Rahna Epting. She's the Executive Director of MoveOn. Rahna. Cathy Feingold, who's the Director of the International Department of the AFL-CIO. This is Cathy. Sara Haghdoosti, who is the Executive Director of Win Without War. And Patrick Gaspard, President and CEO of the Center for American Progress. We're going to dive right into exploring a whole set of issues rooted in the fact that this year is the year of elections globally, not just here in the United States, though we tend to focus a little bit more on our own political and cultural problems. And within this moment, in the American imagination, foreign policy has created all sorts of discussion about America's role on the world stage, American identity. How does that translate through foreign policy, and what does it mean to people here at home? So for this discussion, as we tease out a different set of ideas, whether it be national security or economic security or justice, I wanted to start with Rahna, specifically because of the communities that you organize and work with. This idea of activism on foreign policy issues, is it new? Because it tends to not be at the top of voters' mind. And does it actually translate to voting trends?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Great question. Not new. We can think back over the course of decades how foreign policy has impacted what happens at the ballot box, and I think that is even salient today. But I'll harken back to my own experience and MoveOn's experience over a little over 20 years ago around the Iraq War. And we know that activism, or the way people experience war in particular in the name of the United States, has been an animating issue that does show up in elections. And in the Iraq War, that was in my personal experience, that really catapulted me into a life of political activism. So it also creates a whole nother generation of activists that remain active in the political ecosystem year after year, decade after decade. And progressive foreign policy, we should actually talk about what we mean by that, but I'll just, in short, say diplomacy first. Let's not rush to war to solve all the problems. That actually is not just a morally and ethically position, but it is an electorally salient one that is a winning position in elections. And we saw that throughout the Iraq War. Hundreds of thousands of people mobilized on the streets to protest George W. Bush heading into war. I was one of them. Many of you probably were as well. And over time, progressives led the way. They pushed Democrats to a much stronger position on this. And in 2006, in the midterms, and in 2008 in the presidential, we saw that a less hawkish position is what helped Democrats win the day in those elections. We also see that in the presidential elections. We saw that, I actually have my list. We saw that in Obama versus McCain in 2008. We saw that in Trump versus Clinton, unfortunately, in 2016. And then we saw that also with Biden as he campaigned in 2020, promising to end endless wars. And that helped him win. That was one of the reasons I believe helped him win in that election cycle. And now we see Donald Trump poised to exploit the current situation in Israel, Gaza, and how that's going to show up in November. I could go on, but I don't want to filibuster too long.
Let's pick up Sara, with you on that idea of what is electorally salient right now. Is it Ukraine? Is it Gaza? Is it Israel? Why is it not what's happening on the border of Azerbaijan?
So I reject the premise. I think
I love when people do that.
there is a lot of people in this country where what is happening on the border of Azerbaijan deeply matters to them. And I think that we as a community need to do a much better job of not erasing those voters and those voices. We talk about foreign policy like there are not people in this country who have family connections and deep commitment to what happens around the world. And it's just not okay. That's not how people work. That's not how this country is made up. The reason why we win elections, all the things that Rahna was just talking about, is because as progressives, we have forged multi-generational, multi-racial coalitions. And that's why we have people like Ilhan Omar, like Pramila Jayapal, like Summer Lee, like all of our champions in Congress are because of that. And we need to stop giving away our power by saying people don't care about our issues. Because when we do that, we are doing the thing that the people who have been in power for so long always want to do, which is talk about security only for some people and not for all of us. And our community can do better than that. And when we do better than that, when we actually live our values, when we talk about being safe, keeping our families safe as being the thing that is most important to all of us, there is no kitchen table issue that's more important than keeping your kids safe, making sure your grandparents, your uncles, your aunties, your spouse are safe. And we need to acknowledge the immense power we have in talking about it that way and acknowledging the amount of voters who deeply care about our issues and who have delivered elections on that.
Sara, thank you for that. Picking up on that idea of safety. The language of national security has seeped into so many things, teeing off of safety. Economic security. What is economic security in this globalized economy with trade negotiations that were, and trade deals that were meant to bring democracy to other countries? What does that mean for unions right now?
Great question, and thanks so much for having me here today. I love being in conversations like this because I spend my time sitting in these uncomfortable spaces of leading the labor movement's international policy and having to represent 60 different affiliates with all kinds of ideas about what security means. But I will say one thing. I think it's pretty clear that economic security must be part of our national security. And I think what this administration started to do was ask different questions, which has sent really different messages around the world. They asked different questions, for example, about worker-centered trade, worker-centered foreign policy. We learned mistakes from the fight on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and from there we got people grappling with, well, what does foreign policy for the middle class actually mean? So I'd start by saying, first of all, we need a new set of questions. And this question, I think on the last panel, they said people-centered security. I dig a little deeper. I'd say worker-centered security. It sends a very specific message to the people in this country and around the world who are working day in and day out and want to make sure that they can live with dignity. I have found that workers here and workers around the world are interconnected by a few things. One is they need power in their workplaces. They need democracy in their workplaces. If they don't have that, they can't bargain collectively for wages, they can't improve their working conditions, and they can't shape their workplaces. So I think that is one sense of security. And this administration has actually had some really positive steps. It is the first administration that has gone around the world, and when Ambassador Tai goes to negotiate trade agreements, she meets with unions. Secretary of Commerce is actually asking about unions. The first time in my lifetime that the Secretary of Commerce has said, can I meet with unions? It sends a very different message because we've had a corporate-based trade model. And to ask a new set of questions, which are, what impact would these economic policies have on the livelihoods of workers and their communities? And that means that we can't just see that in a silo. We also have to see that on the impact of climate. The other two areas I just want to raise in terms of security is we're in a time of incredible transition. Working people actually support climate transition, but they want to know it's going to be done justly. So what are we doing to ask the questions around security and the floors that we need to build under people in this country and around the world to get them off of fossil fuel jobs, intensive jobs, to shift how things are happening, technology, which is, impacting lives. We need to be able to message to working people in this country and around the world. One, they're going to have a say in how these kinds of technologies or the transition to clean energy is going to happen in their workplaces. How is new technology going to be introduced? Will it be for surveillance or for improving the way that they can work safely in their workplaces? These are intentional policy choices about how people can feel more secure in their workplaces. So I think it's a time of incredible change, and we have incredible opportunity. Ask new questions, shape policies that respond to those questions, and get working people at the table to help shape and implement those policies for greater economic security in the workplace and democracy in their workplaces and in their communities.
Thank you, Cathy. So picking up then on this idea of transition and change that goes along with what we've experienced as activists and voters all along, the kinds of people we're looking to bring to the table, but also having a sense of justice and workers and economic security, all of this as a holistic collective movement. That's not what we're experiencing right now at the border. Patrick, we're looking at, right?
So I get the border question.
You get the border question. You get the border question, and here's why. Because it goes to this idea of what it means to be American and what the changing lines. It's not just the way we do work, the boundaries. We can call it a migration question because this is a foreign policy issue, but this is the one that comes closer to home. In that context, we are seeing right now in this moment that policymakers are pushing forward legislation that is meant to be compromise and then filibustering their own pieces of legislation they've passed. So how do we even begin to wrangle a progressive version of border in this environment?
Phenomenal question that I'm going to wrestle with. So, but let me just...
I thought you were going to give us the 10-second answer and solve it for all of us.
Done. But let me just first quickly express appreciation to CIP for convening this. Want to say, Rahna, I +1 on everything that you said, but I wanted us to be careful about defining progressive foreign policy through the prism only of military defense versus diplomacy. There are extraordinary affirmative opportunities that are available to us as progressive on transnational challenges in the economy, certainly on climate, but on generative AI as well, and what it could possibly mean, and what it means to have progressive transnational solutions. So I want to just move away from the military framework. Can't answer the question on border and migration and what Republicans are doing now without also touching on your pushback against the general premise of where people see their interests and where Americans, particularly new Americans, see their interests. I cut my teeth in politics in a town called New York, and for decades in that city, you did not run for governor or U.S. senator or mayor unless you were speaking to the three I's of Ireland, Italy, and Israel. Very 20th century construct. America has completely changed, right? The immigration laws that were socialized in 1965 that allowed my family to eventually migrate here, plus the third wave of migration that we got 25 years after that, utterly changed the composition of the U.S. So now when I go and I have conversations on college campuses, I'm just as likely to get a question about Somalia, what the U.S. is doing in the Horn of Africa, as I am to get a question about what's happening in Latin America or what's happening in Central Europe. Migration and the border is a challenge in this moment, in this illiberal moment, in this authoritarian moment that is a global challenge. I remember being in a conversation in Rome 2 years ago and found myself there the same day that Steve Bannon was there as he was rallying conservative interests from throughout Europe on this question of migration and lifting up and amplifying the replacement theory. The contagion has spread all over the globe, and we should recognize as progressives that they are networked with one another, and we should be networked with our counterparts in other parts of the world on this question. what's happening right now on Capitol Hill. So we should understand that Republicans are jumping one over each other to filibuster on this because you have profound demographic cleavages that exist in the country right now. And there are Republicans who are in not safe seats who need to be able to find some way to moderate their position on this issue. But now they have the overwhelming imperative of trying to capture the presidency, and they have the negative charisma of Donald Trump, pushing them in an altogether different direction from solutions to being able to hold up a space of contestation against Joe Biden on the one issue where they believe he has profound vulnerability. And guess what? He does. Rahna and I are part of work together at immigration coalitions, and it's been interesting to see data that demonstrates that it's not just Americans who live at the borders, it's not just Americans who live in spaces that are receiving communities, but it's Americans in dense urban centers that are also sharing this concern. We're seeing black and brown numbers change, interestingly, on immigration in certain pockets of the United States, so that Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries are also searching for ways to strengthen asylum protocols, while at the same time making it clear that they believe that there's something broken about the immigration system. There is a downward pressure on resources that Americans perceive exists in this moment, and Republicans are going to be running their campaign this year through the prism not of freedom, which is their traditional space, but fear and security, personal security, economic security, cultural security. The economic numbers that Joe Biden has posted has made it difficult for them to keep pressing into inflation. The culture wars launched by DeSantis and company have failed in many instances and overwhelmed by things like abortion at the ballot. But personal security, conflating minor spikes in crime during COVID with this notion of disorder at the border has been powerfully salient for them, and they're not giving it up as an issue in this election.
I had a conversation, or as part of a panel that was reacting to this statement by the sheriff of Eagle Pass, Texas, and he said this: "It's not about crime. No, this is not about crime. It's about national security. It's about what's happening at the border." Cathy, I'm going to go back down the line then. You are deeply connected to people who are wrestling with what this resource challenge means, of influx of people from outside, changing nature, transition of jobs. What do you tell them that helps connect people in a sense of shared humanity?
So first of all, let me just turn that national security question. It is about economic security and dignity. It's a framework we should claim, right? It's about asking the question, how do we shape policies that ensure everyone has the right to dignity and the right to safe migration, if that is what they want? Let me give some examples, because I just came out of the AFL-CIO Immigration Committee, and so let me give some real-time examples of what's happening. What is happening is we have TPS clinics happening in Chicago. We have union halls opening up to make sure that families have what they need as they're entering, as we've got busloads of people coming. The same is happening in New York City. What we need to have happen is make a connection between people coming and getting decent work to them. One of the statistics that we use a lot is we spend 12 times the amount on immigration enforcement than we do in labor enforcement. Imagine if we were creating decent workplaces, instead of having raids at the poultry plants, we were making sure that there were good health and safety protections happening there. Again, going back to my point that we want to figure out policies that ensure that every single worker, wherever they're coming from, wherever they are working here and around the world, has a safe and secure work environment. And so I think the trade-offs that have been posed around the current bill, we don't think this bill is going to move forward. I think it's apparent. The big question we're grappling with is, who is our partner? Who are we negotiating with? And so I think what people in the labor movement are doing is we need to take it on ourselves for the time being. There are people in our cities, there are people in our workplaces, in our communities who need help. It is up to us to make sure that we are connecting the dots between what is happening. The Department of Labor has decent work programs that they're developing, making sure those investments are going to the right places. How do unions create hiring halls, whether virtually or in the communities? Many of the people coming have skill sets that are needed. How do we harness that? How do we make sure that they are being respected and integrated into our communities? So I think that's the most immediate. It is definitely imperfect at best at this point. I think there's a lot of tension because we don't have, well, I know that Tom Perez is working over 24/7 to try to make sure that we're connecting the dots between the various services and agencies. But for the time being, I think we really need to ask the question around how are we making sure that, you know, we have a broken system. We heard on the last panel, we need deep reforms to our immigration system, but people who are coming here need to have rights, need to have protections, and the labor movement will continue to advocate to connecting the dots that we want to see more resources put into ensuring decent work, protections for all workers in this country. We're not going to let workers be pitted against each other in a workplace where some people have rights and others don't. And I think that is the framework that we're using in the labor movement, rights for every single worker who's in this country.
Cathy, you're talking about a very particular tactical approach for a specific group of voters, activists, you know, union folks. I know Patrick wants to chime in, but I want to get also Rahna and Sara in on this. Is that the theory of collective action that's going to work in this moment of the border crisis, right? Like the border taking over everything other than economics, justice, all of the other issues.
Big questions. I don't know where to start. You know, MoveOn's a rapid response organization. So when our folks get engaged, it's through an email or a text message, and it's at a moment where people are so frustrated they want to do something, and it's usually in moments of acute crisis. So a war or family, actual footage of children being ripped away from their parents' arms at the border. You know, we organize those protests as well. So I think that kind of goes to what, Sara, what you were talking about, which is like, do people care here in this country? Yes, they do. Whether or not they are motivated to act, to do something, depends on an array of factors, whether they understand that there is a theory of change, there is an ability to to influence a decision maker, and whether there's infrastructure to be able to organize those folks into collective action. And I think that, you know, as a ecosystem, I would say progressive ecosystem, we have a ways to go to build a robust infrastructure that can truly take that energy and those concerns and mobilize it into action. And there's just not enough of us that have the capacity to do it. Most of the organizations domestically, you know, thanks to labor, thanks to CAP, thanks to Women Without War, I think all of us are some exceptions, but most of the progressive institutions we work with focus purely on domestic politics, and it's very hard to get them to engage in what they see as foreign policy or something that is about something that goes beyond the borders of the United States. I probably didn't answer your question,
I think it's very helpful to hear your model and your space, right? That this is a tactical piece of the puzzle that MoveOn has taken. Win Without War does take foreign policy and try to connect all of these dots together. So in this moment where people have a very fear-centric, or as Patrick said, personal safety and security-centric mindset, how do you work with that?
You don't shy away from it. And we
Is
have
that a different version of lean in? Because I want to lie
different
down
version
most
of
the
lean
time.
in. We have hundreds of thousands of activists across the country, and it is such a privilege getting to talk to them. And they are so hungry for what our proactive, positive vision is. And when I go out there and I talk to folks about, take a second and imagine what our country would look like if we gave single moms in this country, if we gave first-generation college students, and if we gave people who are doing the genuine work of forging peace the same benefit of doubt that we give generals in the military. So imagine that when they came to Congress, we not only gave them all the money they needed and then some, but members of Congress were falling over themselves to see how they could get any unfunded priority lists they wanted at their disposal. And then imagine that if they, say, never passed an audit, like the Pentagon has failed to do in its history, that the response from our leadership was that it's okay. because we know the work you are doing in your communities, it is going to be what changes and makes your community safer. And that vision is what people believe. It is so much more compelling than build a wall. And this is the thing. We need to be able to tie those things together. People want to be safe. People want to know that their kids can go to school and be safe. And I will say, as a mother who just had to watch her 6-year-old go through a gun shooting drill at school, I don't feel like my kids are safe. And as a mother with kids who have Jewish and Muslim heritage and seeing all of the vile discourse that our leaders continually let perpetuate, I don't feel like my kids are safe. And I know that the solution isn't more guns. It's not more of the same broken things we've seen over and over again. It's the ideas of people in this room. You all have the transformative ideas around how we change this, how we can fundamentally create transformation to actually solve problems. And I think what is holding us back in terms of how do you actually make people safe is how do we translate that so that people hear it? And I say this with love, as someone who's very much part of this community. Our community is fantastic as taking truly fantastic ideas and turning them into incomprehensible acronyms. And the novelist in me, my ask is, if we can talk about our ideas like we're talking to people and give ourselves permission to not always have to be the experts in the room and to talk as moms, as dads, as people who care about this, to use I statements. I know so many people of color who don't use I statements when we talk about the places we're from and our families. And I think us modeling that leadership will really help change that discourse around how, when we ask questions and are out there showing leadership about what can we actually do to keep people safe in this country.
I'm going to pick up your example then and say I am part of a Black family where the military was a deeply powerful part of the economic progress story. And it was the promise of, you know, the profession, the training, economic security, and then free college. So there is and this is the same military that over the years brought back the freedoms they experienced in World War II as being treated as equal men and women. Bring that back here, and you suddenly have a movement that begins because of that experience. We now have a 40% minority, all voluntary military, of which the ruling class, the officers, are largely white men. So how do we harness that as progressives? Do we harness that? You mentioned let's not look at this through only a military, or not shove the military framework to the side. How do we blend this?
These are profound challenges. So, you know, it's interesting. I just winced when you described the conditions in the military as all voluntary. When we consider the profound,
I'm not getting drafted anytime soon.
Profound economic dislocations that exist in certain communities, and when we see the disproportionate
who
percentage,
volunteers?
Well, when we see the disproportionate percentage of, well, we have the recent example of the 3 members of service who tragically lost their lives just last week, who were all African Americans from challenged spaces. So what voluntary means in this economy and in this and the cultural norms that we've allowed to persist for some time and that we've actually put scaffolding around is something that just kind of makes me wince. But to just pull back the immigration discussion back into the realm of foreign policy, we have to remember that a different conversation was available to us before 9/11, right? 9/11 profoundly changed the equation around comprehensive immigration reform in this country. It gave extremists an opportunity to, again, conflate the challenge at the border with national security issues. It led to the overinflation of this government agency that we call the Department of Homeland Security, which is this extraordinary octopus that I don't actually think should exist in its form, profoundly unaccountable. But I want to, if I can, just step back. I think that your vision, your argument, everything you just said was profoundly compelling. But here's the thing about the Build the Wall cohort. We have to recognize that this is not truly a participatory democracy, that the rules are baked in a way that allows and enables minoritarian rule in this country. And so your vision is a compelling one. The question is, how do we make it more compelling than Build the Wall in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin a few months from now? Because the path is not one that is linear for us in that conversation. Also want to, I wanted to talk about my friend Viktor Orban for a second in the context. My dear friend Viktor Orban in the context
You were on the phone with him the other day.
What? Speed dial. I've spent a fair amount of time in my old life in Hungary. It was always interesting for me to see the demonstrations. You get 1 million people on the streets of Budapest, all young, fighting for economic opportunity, pushing back against the anti-immigrant rhetoric, railing against academic censorship. 1 million people, and you would think, okay, Viktor Orban's on his heels, and his mayoral candidate won't win in Budapest, and yet, there's constituency for the argument. There's constituency for the ugliness. Marie Le Pen doesn't say the things that Le Pen says because she fears that she's not going to be able to put together an electoral majority. Same in Italy, same in so many other places where we have real concern. We should recognize that despite how we feel about ourselves, we're not that much different than any of those spaces. The same constituency that's available and mobilizable for Viktor Orban that resists the protests in the big cities in Hungary were all available for Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis and the cruel cohort that are trying to create as much of a closed society as they possibly can here. Why is that? There is an existential demographic threat that in some spaces is unspoken in this country, but that is driving the domestic politics that we have and that influences significantly the foreign policy that is litigated by both Republicans and Democrats in office on trade, on economic investment, on whether or not we're going to give primacy to right and democracy or get engaged in a different kind of global competition. We are now in a place in the world where you win points by arguing that you build a moat around yourselves and pull up the drawbridge. Our progressive transnationalism, internationalism, is not actually ascendant in the moment. We should recognize that, and we should fight fiercely and make our arguments recognizing the profound existential demographic threat that folks are feeling that's creating a response that enables Donald Trump to gain a purchase on the electorate. This is not a minor thing that we can kind of push through with our idealism.
According to Gallup, if you give Americans a list of what are several actions under the rule of law that could be taken, 40% support the ones that actually end up getting defined as authoritarian. Right? This is not the ascendancy of liberalism, but liberalism, which is why we are calling ourselves progressive, failed many of us who are sitting here on this stage and our families. So, Rahna, take us then to that next step. How do you organize around this idea of whether it's combating racism, combating injustice, terms that frankly don't really get recognized in foreign policy circles because, those are objective decisions that people are making about security?
I'm still trying to decipher what your question is here. So how
what
do
are
we...
you doing with
Okay.
these terms that we're so comfortable with in the domestic space?
Right.
And taking the foreign policy challenges that we have, the nationalism challenges that we see, rising nationalism.
Yes.
What are you guys planning to do with that?
Well, we try to make sense of it with our members. You know, we have millions of people all across the country who are engaged in electoral politics. We work to build political power and capture governing power so that we can advance progressive change. That's like our core focus. And the really important thing is laying out the contrast, connecting the dots, not just between the contrast between the choices people have in a presidential election or any other election, but it's like also how that's connected to what's happening globally. But I'll just say here in the US, you know, what is possible under a Trump administration versus what is possible under a Biden administration are drastically different worlds. And you have to frame it in the contrast of what is possible. And under Trump, well, I don't want to go into that. But under Biden, you know, we really talk about with our members, there is opportunity. This is a better field, a better playing ground for us to organize on, to advance and push progressive values. It may not be a guarantee, but it allows us to actually like play in the game because Biden believes in democratic norms. You know, Democrats believe in governing for the people. We may not agree with them on all the issues, but it is up to us, the people, to build that power, sufficient political power to actually influence the decisions they're making. And so I don't think it's one narrative rules them all. It is different for different, you know, voting blocks and for different constituencies. But really being able to lay out the choice and the contrast is incredibly important. And with the issues of race and all of that, it's hard to simply give you, it's hard to give you a simple answer. But when we are thinking about this current presidential election year that we are in, I think there are some core values that people talk about here on this panel. Security is really important. You're seeing Republicans really exploit the sense of security in a myriad of ways and exploit the sense of fear in a myriad of ways with a lot of conspiracy theories. You know, and MoveOn has long pointed out and mobilized people out of that sense of fear about what the radical right will do. So I'm not saying that's ineffective tool or should not be used, but we try not to spread the conspiracy theories along with them. But I think that the contrast is the most important.
Cathy, the idea of micro-targeting for audiences, right? There's no one message for all.
Well, I know that in my building, there are a lot of people, probably with all of you, looking at data, and there is micro-targeting, but I wanted to take this to a little, you know, one thing that Patrick said, I have the privilege of also being the deputy president of the global labor movement, where we are constantly building this progressive transnationalism, one of the largest global infrastructures, non-governmental infrastructures in the world. And so when Bolsonaro, you know, we're with the Brazilians trying to figure out our strategies together because we have so much in common. Just to your point, the labor movement is on it. AFD in Germany, we have been plotting this, and I know I saw FES in the room, they've been supporting this. You know, we need approaches as a couple billion people go to the polls this year. We know there's a lot at stake. So a couple things. One is we can't assume that democratic institutions serve people. And I think that's, you know, these questions around democracy, sort of this corporate model, it failed people. And we had like a human rights movement that put some Band-Aids on it and made people feel a little bit better. It didn't make a lot of people feel more secure. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is, I mean, the answer to all of this, because we have to walk and chew gum. We know we're in a moment, we have only a few months. We're in an election as we speak. Is, you know, one is I don't think there's anything you can do that replaces direct conversations. And in the labor movement, we will be doing that. You know, in the workplaces, people that trust people where you can have these real conversations. So I don't think there's anything that replaces real conversations about the issues that impact the lives. The other is, and I think I just wanted to end on a more positive note. I mean, imagine, because we're all imagining that you have Biden 2.0. What's the big exciting thing to tell people about? What is it? I don't want to, you know, not the scary things and migration and buses and people are coming, you know, like all of the Trump. But I think what we don't have quite yet is what's the exciting thing? Is there a new, you know, I'm going to just for shorthand, like a trade adjustment assistant, but big, bold program for anyone impacted by AI in their workplaces? Or something really exciting if you're going to be impacted by the energy transition, that you get retraining. Like, what's the excitement? And I think that's the message. I just want to be mindful that we don't spend all of our time meeting Trump in the negative message. And that I know I have 2 young kids who will be their first time voting in a presidential election, and they're kind of asking, what's the exciting thing? They care about climate. They care about not these silos. They care about the intersection of climate migration. They want to know that if people are moving because of climate issues, it's going to happen in this country as well, that they're going to have access to resources and to decent work. And so I just want to urge all of us, we're really good on the left of talking about all of the problems, and there are a ton of problems. What's the bold new ideas?
So I'm going to ask then, in the 1 minute we have left together with this panel, Patrick, you get the 1 minute question, big, bold, and progressive. What does that mean? What does that look like?
On foreign policy?
Yes. Let's do it.
All right, so real talk here. Right now, we're operating under a $873 billion defense budget in the U.S. in this fiscal year, which is $45 billion over what President Biden requested. We're not going to be able to meet goals, progressive goals, domestic or foreign, if we don't tackle that as progressives, challenge that, and ask really tough and provocative questions of our own friends about this. Right now, there are 327 million people in the world who are food insecure, and we have 50% of the world's resources controlled by less than 2% of the population. What we're doing to meet that need in a way that will put the U.S. in an altogether different footing in the big power competition with China, which we're spiraling towards. Powerful, important question that is connected to that defense $45 billion overcommitment. I think that would be something that we are taking on in an aggressive way, in a creative way, and in a daring way in this country. The other stuff is not nearly as important.
Daring, bold, progressive, optimistic, and providing a sense of safety and security to people. I think we've covered a lot of ground here today. Thank you, Rahna, Sara, Cathy, Patrick. Thank you all for joining us in this engaging conversation.